Well, I've been chatting about the Gaza and the Israel conflict that's going on at the moment to a couple of friends, and the sentiment is exactly what is going on there and who's in the right and who's in the wrong, and is it possible to work out? And I thought that I would give my 2 cents worth. I mean, what do I know? I'm just a surfer at the end of Africa, but I would draw on my years long ago at varsity studying the Middle East conflicts, and then also on studying comparative religions, where we looked at the Jewish faith and the Islamic faith and the Christian faith. And of course, it's all intertwined. And I would also take my perceptions from the time I spent in Israel, working and then traveling across Israel and Palestine. So don't be too harsh on me. I'll give it a go. Well, the roots of everything start in Jerusalem, which is about 30 kilometers inland from the Mediterranean coastline. And that is where about 3,000 years ago, the first Jewish temple was built on a hill near a spring, and the remnants of the temple are still there today. The Temple Mount, or the footprint of where the temple was, is quite large, about 4 rugby fields long and 2 rugby fields wide. And that's where the first united Jewish people settled, establishing their kingdom under Solomon, as found in the Torah, or in the Old Testament. But it's been millennia since then, and in between, Jerusalem has been conquered more than 20 times by different empires and armies. And these range from the Egyptians to the Persians, or the modern-day Iraqis, to the Romans, to the Crusader Christians in the early Middle Ages, and many more conquerors, including the French under Napoleon, and the Turks of the Ottoman Empire, and the British in the 20th century. The first temple was destroyed long ago, and a second temple built, which was also destroyed. For long swathes of time, Muslim Arab kingdoms have ruled Jerusalem and the area around it. And in time, they built 2 mosques on the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Golden Dome of the Rock. Now, the latter mosque, the Dome of the Rock, covers the rock from which, according to tradition, the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. And that happens to be the same rock over which the Jewish temple was built before then. So all that remains of the temple is one small segment of the perimeter wall, which they now call the Western Wall. Then, not far away, you have the hill of Golgotha, which is Christianity's holiest site, where Jesus was crucified, and this is covered by a church called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So there is a very small square meterage of area in the middle of Jerusalem that's contested by the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims, and all three have had periods or chapters where they have ruled Jerusalem over the centuries, and some have come and gone as conquests have happened. The most recent people to conquer Jerusalem are the Jews. In 1948, after the Second World War, many Jews, particularly Holocaust survivors, made their way to Jerusalem looking to establish a Jewish state which had been promised to them by the British, who at the time were ruling Palestine as a protectorate. However, the British had also promised Palestine to the Arabs, and after much conflict, the British handed it over to both. A lot of land was incorporated into Jordan, Egypt, and Syria, the surrounding Arab states, and the Jews were given some land, and they declared an independent state, Israel, in 1948. Now, the land granted for Israel was small and patchy, with the bulk of it being on the coastline centering around Tel Aviv, and then a thin corridor to Jerusalem, where the Jews were given half the city. Crucially, the Temple Mount was granted to Jordan and the Arabs, which left the Jews much aggrieved. This lasted until the Six-Day War in 1967, when the Israelis invaded Egypt, all the way down to the Suez Canal, and they also captured the other half of Jerusalem from Jordan. And so the Temple Mount fell into Jewish hands for the first time in 1,800 years, and they have ruled Jerusalem and the Temple Mount ever since. Consequently, in 1967, Israel had now expanded its borders in all directions, contrary to the land grants given by Britain, and the roots of the current dispute between Gaza and Israel go back to that 90 1967 war. Israel obviously now became a state that contained many Arabs within its borders, and they are Israeli citizens. However, they're much aggrieved, saying that they're treated as second-class citizens and not getting sufficient protection by the judiciary. Then on top of that, over the past 50 years or so, Israel has increasingly evicted Arabs from their villages and started moving Jewish settlers into the houses.
Also in this building we have another 4 families who are facing eviction orders recently. 2 families up there and 2 families down.
And many of these Arabs have their title deeds to their homes that go back 200 years or so to the Ottoman Empire. And this policy of evicting them has caused a long and simmering bitterness.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
No one is allowed to steal it, يا عمي.
However, there are large chunks of land into which more and more Arabs, or let's call them Palestinians at this point, have been pushed. And in time, Israel has handed these towns and settlements back to the Palestinians. And these areas are concentrated on what's known as the West Bank, around Hebron, and in the Gaza Strip. And the Palestinian Authority has been granted self-rule in these areas. And both these areas, we must say, are deeply impoverished. On top of this, Israel has built a dividing wall between the West Bank and Israel, similar to the Berlin Wall but without minefields. And Israel strictly controls access into the country. Of course, you have many Palestinians wanting to cross to and fro daily to work in Israel, which is much more prosperous than the Palestinian enclaves. Gaza, the other area controlled by the Palestinians themselves, is a coastal area, ring-fenced by Israel on 3 sides. There's no wall, and a naval blockade presents access to the coastline. It comprises about 2 million Palestinians, with 600,000 of them concentrated to the north in Gaza City, and the strip of land that is Gaza is about 40 kilometers long and 5 kilometers wide, and there too access from and to Israel is strictly controlled. The Israelis used to rule both the West Bank and Gaza, but have now withdrawn completely, and the same applies to many towns and villages like Jericho and Bethlehem. And in time, Gaza has come to be ruled by Hamas, a militant right-wing Palestinian party, and they are supported strongly by Iran, who, despite the blockade, still supplies Gaza with arms, and in particular missiles, and these are the rockets currently being fired from Gaza into Israel. And what sparked this latest flare-up a week ago was that Palestinians in Jerusalem went to the Temple Mount to celebrate Eid. Thousands gathered to pray in both mosques, and clashes broke out between the Jews and the Palestinians, starting with stone throwing, then escalating until the point where the Israeli police stormed the Temple Mount and threw tear gas and stun grenades all around and including into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, injuring over 100 Palestinians. Now, adding fuel to the fire was the fact that a Palestinian neighborhood near to the Temple Mount has recently been the subject of home evictions, with Jewish settlers now moving in to occupy those houses. And it was at this point that Hamas in Gaza, which is about 70 kilometers away, in support of their Palestinian brothers and sisters in Jerusalem, began launching rockets aimed at Greater Jerusalem, where many Israelis live. The rockets then were redirected towards the Jewish city of Ashkelon, which is just above Gaza, and then further afield at Tel Aviv, which is about 40 kilometers away from Gaza. And now the rockets are flying all over the place. So it's a deeply complex situation with historical roots and old antagonisms that go back far into the past. In Israel, the Likud government under Netanyahu has ruled the country since 2009, and they are right-wing, but it's a tenuous government with much opposition from more liberal parties in Israel. it's important to realize that there is significant opposition to Netanyahu from the left, and these liberally minded Jews oppose the current policies, especially those relating to the eviction of Palestinians from their homes and the creation of Jewish settlements in parts of Israel, which are densely populated by Palestinians. Of course, many people want to coexist peacefully with their Muslim neighbors, whether they live inside Israel or in the Palestinian Authority areas of the West Bank and Gaza. But somehow Netanyahu has clung to power, continues to do so, and he does it by coalition alliances with more Jewish Orthodox parties that are very right-wing, and they keep implementing these policies of the eviction of Palestinians from their homes. So many Jewish Israelis are against conflict with the Palestinians. You know, they're sick of these wars that flare up every 5 or 10 years, and which have done so for thousands of years. And more than anything else, they want to live a peaceful existence where they can just get on with their lives. And the feeling is that the Jews are not going to abandon their country, and neither are the Palestinians, so they might as well get on with one another and build a harmonious future. Many of the Israeli Jews support the two-state solution, which is pushed by the United Nations and has lukewarm support from the Americans, depending on whether the Democrats or the Republicans are in control. And Trump in particular favored Likud's approach, Netanyahu's approach, and moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which was symbolically supporting the right wing and their resolve to hold on to Jerusalem at all costs. And of course then there are the extremists on the left and right in the area who are very zealous about making the whole of Palestine Jewish or Palestinian. So we basically have a proxy war going on here, with the Iranians supplying rockets to Hamas in Gaza and the Americans pumping into Israel to prop up the country. And it appears to be in US interest to keep Israel strong in this predominantly Arab part of the world, and it's in Iran's interest to support the Palestinians in an ongoing low-intensity civil war against the Israelis. Of course, you also have the oil-rich Arab states in the Middle East as well, but none of them make any significant effort to help the Palestinians. It seems it's in their interests to keep the Palestinians impoverished and in a state of conflict with the Israelis. So it's a complicated regional situation, but there's no doubt that the Palestinians are much aggrieved, particularly with the home evictions, and there's no doubt that Israel responds to opposition in a heavy-handed manner. Especially when Hamas launches rockets into Israel, then we see how Netanyahu reacts by indiscriminate artillery fire into Gaza using large artillery guns, and also by demolishing large residential and commercial buildings where intelligence reports that the militants are operating or living. There is nowhere for the people of Gaza to hide. They don't have bomb shelters as the Israelis have in Ashkelon and in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and the other cities. So they're very vulnerable, despite Israel claiming that they're exercising restraint, warning people when the buildings are about to be destroyed, but that's not always the case. So a lot of sympathy lies with the Palestinians in Gaza in this conflict. And then on the other hand, the rockets fired from Gaza into Israel, they don't have that acute accuracy to hit a given target. So they land randomly, sometimes injuring and killing people. And Israel has this defense system known as the Iron Dome, which detects incoming rockets and then intercepts them in the air. And so far it's been widely successful. The latest stats show that about 90% of Hamas missiles are being stopped. Nonetheless, for people on both sides of the conflict, this is a war of fear. Both have enemy drones and missiles over their cities, and neither know where they're going to land, so you have civilians on both sides terrorized by the unknown and by the sight of rockets crisscrossing the sky above, and it causes much psychological trauma on both sides. In addition, we now have the occurrence of two other phenomena which ring the alarm bells. One is that rockets have been fired into Israel by the Hezbollah Arabs in Lebanon to the north. And that's another group which is funded and armed by Iran. And their intentions are unclear, but Israel must be fearful at this stage of the war breaking out on two separate fronts. And the other troubling events involve the clashes between Palestinians and Jews in the cities and towns across Israel, especially in Lod and in Haifa. And many of these people have lived in relatively peaceful coexistence alongside each other for decades. In fact, there are some model communities of cooperation, particularly in the northern part of Israel. In Accra, one of the most peaceful communities, Palestinians have burnt down a hotel and a restaurant owned by Jews, and vigilante groups are now roaming the streets. The war with Gaza will end in a week or two. That's normally how long these wars last, as in 2014. But it's the long-term effect on Jewish-Palestinian coexistence with Israel that is worrying. So I've said a lot here and tried to stay objective, but inevitably there will be criticism of my synopsis. What is clear is that it's another tragic conflict in the area, with many civilians or non-combatants on both sides suffering the consequences. And it's a tragedy for all of them caught up in these events that are often beyond their control. So that's the way I see it. I've tried to be neutral, look at both sides, and not take a side. I'm sure that people will have criticisms of what I say. If you're brave enough, then put it down in the comments, but just don't be too hard on me. Thanks.